Okay, so Habakkuk. I copied something I saw online. It says Habakkuk, when hope is hard. So I'm not that smart to come up with something with a nice line like that. But basically, Habakkuk, the book of Habakkuk, is one of the minor prophets. I forget the count now. It's number 8 from the last, from Malachi, counting backwards. It's the 8th of the minor prophets. And it's also a small book, just 3 chapters, and it's the 4th shortest book in the Old Testament. Anyway, when we get to the facts, that's my next screen. I'll reel all of that out very quickly. So let me minimize this. Okay, so yes, I'm recording. Okay, so Habakkuk, again, is one of the minor prophets, and just like we said before, we've been dealing with the minor prophets. We've looked at Zephaniah, we've looked at Obadiah, and today, as God would have it, we're in Habakkuk. And like I said, minor prophet doesn't mean that his authority was less than the other prophets, than the Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, but that the books, the literature we have from them is a lot shorter than those guys. It's really just about the length of their books. They were all prophets in their own rights, equal authority. Okay, so, so 5 facts I have here for Habakkuk is that, like I said, it's only 3 chapters and 56 verses long. And it is the 4th shortest book in the OT, and only Obadiah, Nahum, and Haggai are shorter than Habakkuk. So number 2 is that despite this prophecy has had a tremendous impact on the history of Judaism and Christianity. I got something online where it says that in 1977, I think a man called Jochen published a study that was detailing a survey of 300 scholarly works on this book alone, spanning 150 years. Anybody into theology know that people don't spend their time doing scholarly work like this in this amount of volume on nothing. And right from 1977 to now, the flood of studies on this book continues on the historical angle, the archaeological angle, the theological value, and what have you. So then Habakkuk is an unusual prophetic book in the sense that we said that Obadiah too was unusual in the sense that Obadiah was not addressing the people of Israel. This guy too is not addressing the people of Judah and Israel. Obadiah is different, that was addressing a foreign nation, was an Edom. And then Habakkuk is different, that he's not addressing the people of Judah directly, but rather what we have is a record of a conversation between the prophet Habakkuk and God, all 3 chapters. Excuse me. So, and then number 4, Habakkuk was most likely a contemporary of Zephaniah, of Jeremiah, and probably Daniel and Ezekiel, if he was old enough to see the destruction of Jerusalem. Then he probably prophesied both within and towards the end of King Josiah's reign, 640 to 609 BC. Okay, so those are fast facts. So beyond this, I want to go through a number of probably more than 10. How many do I have here? Like almost a dozen bullet points, major points, to give us the background and context. Context is the situation, what was happening. And like we always do here, and like we've said here many times, and especially in the book of the Bible, it has a context. Then the book of not just verses and chapters have context. The book itself has a context. So the context here is the situation, what was happening. Who was Habakkuk? Why did he write this? Why did he have this conversation with? What's the background to what was going on that he had this conversation with God? So please bear with me before we enter the text. Let me take a few minutes to give us some bullet points. So to take our minds back, we have outlines in our minds about the history of Israel and Judah and all of that. So I'm going to touch on some of that. So basically, after the death of King Solomon, his son Rehoboam ascended the throne in his place. And I think the very costly mistake he made, where he threatened to be more wicked and more strict than his father Solomon had been to the Israelites. And they said, what are we to do to people, house of David, and all of that. And the rebellion was led by a man named Jeroboam against him. And it was not a small rebellion, it was a massive secession of, out of 12 tribes, 10 tribes of occupying most of the land of Israel then broke away. They set up their own capital, had their own king and everything. I think it was Jeroboam himself. And eventually, I've forgotten the name of the king that stopped them from coming down to worship in Jerusalem. Well, Jeroboam too. Okay, clever guy. Okay. Bethel. Okay, they set up building calves in Dan and Bethel. Okay, yes, thank you. Okay, so the northern 10 tribes, the country is split into two unequal halves. The 10 tribes shifted in the north. They stopped being the same country with the south. The south was, what was left was Judah and Benjamin. So it's important we understand all of this part of the history of the Jews because as it plays out, it's very important. Okay, so number two, the northern kingdom of Israel went on to have a succession of 20 kings, right? All of whom were wicked kings. All of them were idolatrous, sinful, twisted kings. None of them was godly. None of them served God. And you know what that means? That means 20 regimes of idol worship in Israel. Idol worship became endemic in Israel. Even people like, what's his name? Elijah and Elisha. Who else did God send to the northern kingdoms? Micah, Amos. They tried their best to minister to these people, to call them back, experienced occasional successes, but immediately the prophet goes away, like they just relapse and even fall deeper than they were before, as it were. So just keep that in mind. Number three, they were eventually punished by God. Surprise. So Bracky, if you're there, please read for us from Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 25 to 30. Just to keep it in mind that, when I said that you went into idolatry headlong for centuries, actually, if I'm correct, you know what is coming, right? God had done what he didn't have to do by sending prophets to call them back, but they did not listen. And then eventually he had to bring down the gavel on their head, as it were. So, and I want us to read Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 25 to 30. I keep referring to it anytime I'm speaking, but forgot where it is, so I remember to pull it up today. So please help us read quickly. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 25 to 30.
Okay, can you hear me well?
Very clearly.
Okay. Deuteronomy 4:25. In the future, sorry, the Bible has NLT. In the future, when you have children and grandchildren, and have lived in the land a long time, do not corrupt yourselves by making idols of any kind. This is evil in the sight of the Lord your God, and will arouse his anger. Today I call on heaven and earth as witnesses against you. If you break my covenant, you will quickly disappear from the land you are crossing the Jordan to occupy. You will live there only a short time. Then you will be utterly destroyed. For the Lord will scatter you among the nations where only a few of you will survive. There, in a foreign land, you will worship idols made from wood and stone, gods that neither see, nor hear, nor eat, nor smell. But from there you will search again for the Lord your God. And if you search for him with all your heart and soul, you will find him. In the distant future, when you are suffering all these things, you will finally return to the Lord your God and listen to what he tells you.
All right, thank you very much, Bracky. All right. So that's, I wanted us to read that for one week. That all this, if you keep reading the Old Testament and you see this cycle of sin, rebellion, and then judgment, you think that maybe God's zone is too much, why, that kind of thing. But God had told them from the onset. In fact, there's a longer passage I didn't bring out for us, for when God told Moses was about to die, and God told him a song to teach the Israelites, and that they should memorize this song and sing it to their children's children. It will be a memorial, to be evidence against them in the future when they start sinning and God brings the hammer down and God comes to judge them. So this was something God had told them, that this is what will happen to you. I will scatter you all over the land. In fact, the idol that you are worshiping in my land, I will chase you away so that you go and worship them very well in those countries. And this time, you're not going to go there on a legal visa program, an immigrant program where you're going to be there as slaves and exiles, right? It's not going to be fun. So, so God did punish the northern 10 tribes in 722 BC. I forgot the name of the Assyrian king. In 2 Kings chapter 17 is recorded, and this is in fulfillment of God's threat of exile if they break his covenants, just as we read in Deuteronomy 4. So beyond that, as one would expect, after destroying the northern 10 tribes, that was a much larger, at least geographically larger. In fact, in terms of population size, it would have been larger than just Judah and Benjamin, right? So that was a much larger nation, and the Assyrians had decimated them and sent them packing into exile. And naturally, the people in Judah and Benjamin, they are much smaller than these guys. If you finish dealing with their big brother, what's next? You just try to finish the job off, right? And then the Assyrians, after dispatching the northern 10 tribes, they naturally come further down inland, down south, and surrounded Jerusalem and tried to attack Jerusalem. And we have this story in, I didn't pull this up, did I? Oh, I didn't. Okay, also in 2 Kings. So, but this was the time when 2 Kings 19. 2 Kings 19, we have this record. And this was the time when we had Judah, luckily for them, had a good king, Hezekiah, and they had the prophet Isaiah. And the two of them cried out to the Lord in prayer, and God, who hears prayer, heard them. In fact, the Assyrian king brought hundreds and hundreds of thousands of soldiers, surrounded Jerusalem. They couldn't run anywhere, and started the siege. And God sent only one of his own soldiers, and he took out 175,000 Assyrian soldiers. And that, of course, in effect, ended the Assyrian campaign, and they ran back with what soldiers and gear they had left, and went back to their country and never came back. So, but then Hezekiah, the good king, died in 686 BC, and his son Manasseh, succeeded him. He ruled for 44 years, was an evil, twisted, idolatrous king, and in fact, as far as he was a poster boy for evil Judean kings. And his son Amon, reigned in his stead for only 2 years after Manasseh dies. His son Amon reigned for only 2 years. But so we get some of his servants, they were like, please, we can't have another Manasseh, and then they ganged up and killed him after only 2 years of being king. So in that 46 years of Manasseh and Amon, they had led the people of Judah deep into idolatry. This was 46 years. So it does count how long somebody has been into a particular sin. Your back becomes bent. It's not that God cannot heal you, but it's you that will not hear word again. All right. So, and then Josiah succeeds his father Amon at the age of 8 and goes on to rule Judah for 31 years. He's a good king. He loves the Lord. In fact, he pays for the temple to be rebuilt. In the time of the almost 50 years of Manasseh and Amon, they had neglected the temple. It was in a state of disrepair. Josiah paid, from his own money, and then they did renovation work, put it back into shape. While they were doing that, they discovered the book of the law, most likely Deuteronomy. Then, just like in the time of Ezra, he declared, a religious revival and everything, instituted reforms, tried to get the people to come back to him. He was a good king. In fact, I didn't bring up the passage where God promised him. I say, you know what? I don't worry, I'm seeing all the things you're doing. Very good. We see, it's too late. Okay, it's too late because the judgment I've prepared for these guys is on its way. For the people of the kingdom of Judah, is on its way. And after you die, the good thing is, I won't bring it when you're alive. It's after you die that it will come on the country. And then, yes, so we need somebody. Is that Aaron? Is you? Okay.
Sorry.
It's okay. Okay, so now, please bear with the story. It's very important to understand what is going on in Habakkuk. So at about this time, the Assyrian Empire, which was the world power thing, like the America of those days, the empire was in decline, and then another small ancient empire called Babylon was on the rise. And both of them at the point, they started to not butt heads with each other. While they were doing that for many years, for decades even, diplomatically, and started having open conflicts and warfare, it allowed the small countries like Judah to face their fronts and to have some breathing space. So they had time to grow and concentrate inwards, and maybe that's the time Josiah had to do the reforms and all those things. So, and then about this time also, Babylon, the smaller country, toppled Assyria and destroyed it and became the world power. Then at some point, the king of Egypt, I think it was Shishak, was trying to go and fight against Babylon but he had to pass through Judah to get there. But Josiah, ill-advised, goes to stop him or prevent him from doing so. And in the battle that ensues, Josiah dies. And then Josiah's son, Jehoahaz, rules in his place, but only for 3 months. And the king of Egypt comes back, deposes him, takes him, drags him all the way to Egypt, and puts his brother called Eliakim, whom the king of Egypt strangely renames Jehoiakim. Now, this Jehoiakim was probably the reigning king of Judah when Habakkuk ministered and prophesied. This was between 609 to 598 BC. And Jehoiakim was a wicked king. He was not like his father, who was a good one. And again leads the country into open rebellion and idolatry and wickedness and violence and everything. And even deliberately rolled back some of Josiah's religious reforms and led the people back to sin. Anyway, basically. So that was a political and religious situation in which Habakkuk lived and ministered. So we'll touch on some of this as we go. Verse 1. So today we'll try to read through the first chapter into chapter 2, verse 1. So verse 1 says, of course, ESV all through. Verse 1 says, so bracking, like this verse 2 now, I have some Bible references there. If you can just put your hands there, be ready for me. So the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. So an oracle is the Hebrew term for burden. You know, the way like the word of the Lord comes to you. And like Jeremiah said, it was like fire in my bones, right? He couldn't help but say it, right? He couldn't keep quiet. So that's the way it felt to the prophets, that when God communicates something to them, they were practically forced to share it. So, and then so it's basically the prophetic message that God gave him. Habakkuk, his name means embrace or strong embrace, not in the way of the casual hug like we do today, but in terms of clinging on to somebody, you know, like the way Jacob wrestled with God, held on to him, and then let him go until he blessed him. So the man's name has something to do with what the book is about also. And then he was a prophet, he's one who spoke for God. So verse 2, O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you, violence, and you will not save? So this verse 2 for me is particularly touching on this.
Can it be prayer?
Okay, the entire book.
Well, because when you read this, it struck me.
Okay.
It's a deep conversation.
It's actually a prayer. It's actually a prayer. So Habakkuk records, so like I said, it's a conversation. There are two people talking. There's Habakkuk addressing God, and then he will sit and wait and play. God will come back and answer him. You know, so I think this reminds us of certain people that took God up on some issue. People like Abraham, when God was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And who's this other person? That's escaping my mind now. Remember the two of them just now. Job, you know, who was like, Lord, please come down here. We have to talk. You know, what is this you're doing to me? And then he ends up losing the conversation, if you put it that way. Okay, so Habakkuk here comes with a complaint. So that's what happens in between chapter 1 and chapter 2. Habakkuk will come, pray to God, say something, make a complaint. It's actually a complaint, it's complaining to God about God. He doesn't understand something God is doing, and he feels that, God, you're falling my hand, or what is going on here? He's perplexed. And then God comes back to him in vision and replies him what he prayed about earlier. So in verse 2, we see, how long shall I cry for help? So it's a common theme throughout scripture. So I only put out 2 references. Psalm 13 verse 1 and Revelation chapter 6 verse 10. So basically, what he's saying here is that he's been praying for a very long time, or for a long time, about something urgent, about something important, about something he feels should be definitely in the revealed will of God, and he cannot understand for the life of him why God will not answer him and why God is not answering his prayer. So, Bracky, Psalm 13 verse 1. Bracky, are you there? Okay, somebody here should, or anybody else online, Psalm 13 verse 1, and somebody else, Revelation chapter 6 verse 10. Okay, yes, who's there? The audio is terrible. Sodium. Hello, sorry, I can't hear you. Maybe he is.
Let me read the verse then. How long will thou forget me, O Lord? However, how long will thou forget me?
All right, so the psalmist there says, how long will you forget me, O Lord? Forever? How long will you hide your face? So basically, it's a common experience for all God's people, where you find yourself in a phase. It's like at the time when you need God the most in your life, you pray with your entire soul, with all your heart, with all your strength, and God is nowhere to be found. And so, and it's something that you see even Jesus in praying, and if this be your will, let this cup pass over, and then there's no answer. I think the answer is clear from the no answer. So we see again in Revelation chapter 6 verse 10. For time's sake, I'll skip it. I'll just mention this is where the souls of those who had been martyred for the name of Christ, are seen in heaven beneath the throne of God, and they're crying to, how long, oh Lord, how long? They've been there waiting, like, are you not going to avenge us again? See these people that killed us, they are walking about free. Don't let them live out their lives and just die in peace. And then they are praying to the Lord and saying, how long, oh Lord? And I think it's something that all of us, if you've been Christian long enough, would have experienced at some point, where you cry out to God, you call out to Him, and it's radio silence all the way. In fact, I heard a preacher call it the silent treatment. That God has given you the silent treatment. Don't worry, that you are in good company. that all of the Bible superstars, including Jesus himself, we faced it at some point. So it doesn't mean that God is not there or He's not listening. It's a test of your fortitude or your faithfulness. Okay, so but then this is not something, it's not a personal request like Habakkuk needs a car for himself or something. The other part of the verse says, or cry to you violence and you will not save. So apparently, the worship of idols. So it's one thing I appreciate about true religion. True religion changes people. True religion affects people morally in terms of the way they behave, the way they think, the way they speak, their priorities. It changes you. It's why we have such a fraud of supposed Christianity today. Anybody who claims to be a Christian, whose life has not been radically changed by Christ, is not a Christian. The person might be sincere, but the person's profession of faith is in doubt. There's always that change in the hearts, and that can be seen on the outside. So the opposite is the case when people are worshiping idols. They become like the demons they're worshiping. They become bloodthirsty. They become proud and arrogant. They become oppressive. They become contentious and violent. Yes.
So is it? Do you think that the demons are possessing them, or not in the physical sense of possessing, or why do you think it happens?
Okay, why? Wale has asked that. Why do I think that happens? So I wouldn't strike out demon possession. So I'll say yes. It should definitely be involved, but I think what is more widespread is that in the worship of demons, in the worship of idols, the restraints that the worship of the true God has, in the sense of him imposing the commandments on us, is removed. That's number one. Number two, the worship of idols curiously has the opposites of God's commandments infused into it. For example, sexual immorality and all those kind of things, having to swear, So it lets out things that or feeds the flesh or allows the flesh to run free, as against what the worship of God does. Yes, Bro,
Okay,
you have to speak up.
Yeah, my suggestion to what you said is some form of where David was saying that the people they become whatever they are worshiping.
Yes.
Same way as God, whoever you're worshiping, like
You become more like it.
the Corinthians say, whoever you are beholding Christ, you are transformed into the image of Christ.
Yes.
So if you are worshiping an idol, whatever that idol is, you're going to transform.
Yeah, but the problem is the idols are just wood and stone. And
Yeah,
freeze.
so in that sense, what is it called? Like I think that the particular verse just say, yeah, if you cast a demon and then you go and later on it comes down to 7. So
Yes.
yeah, well, if it's a tree or worship, you become dead like a tree. There's no emotional.
Let me even say that I've looked into all these demon possessions from reformed sources. When just like Jesus said, when people are sinful, one of the dangers of being sinful, of playing with sin, is that, especially with certain kinds of sin, is that it opens you up to demon possession. Of course, there are no cases in the Bible of Christians being, but at least for the people, they are open, they're wide open, they're sitting doors for all kinds of anything that happens to them. So the influence, both directly and indirectly, idol worship always affects the way people behave. And we see this, and we see violence in Judah. And Habakkuk is seeing this in his country, and he's calling to God to help, but God is not answering. So in verse 3, he said, "Why do you make me see iniquity? And why do you look idly? Why do you idly look at wrong?" I have some comments here, I'll read them soon. "Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise." So basically here in verse 3, Habakkuk his soul is so vexed at what he was seeing in the land. That reminds us of Lot in Sodom. This is in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 7. It talks about Lot's righteous soul being vexed. And this should be common experience for Christians too. I don't know a Christian who lives anywhere in the world who is at peace with what he's seeing all around him. I don't know a Christian from anywhere. I never heard of it. Whether it's Christians in America, Christians in Nigeria. The sin, the corruption, the immorality, the dishonesty. Are you raising your hand? Okay. If you're a Christian, it should get to you. In fact, for me, sometimes I can totally relate to what Habakkuk is experiencing here, in the sense that I find it traumatizing. Just looking at, so what I try to do, I don't know if it's right, is to lock up as much as possible. Of course, when you lock up, you try to as much as possible not dwell on all these things so much. But every now and then, maybe like it's a news flash, a news, you be like, hey, you just burst out, you start shouting again, you get cut to the heart, So basically, you can't avoid it, no matter how much you lock up. That's my point. But it is something that every Christian, and it's a good thing. It shows that your conscience is not dead. You should lament, just like the prophets did, like he's doing here. You should, if the people there are busy enjoying their sin, you should lament, as what you're saying. You should lament the decadence in society. You should lament the level of sexual immorality. You should weep over these things as a Christian. You sit down and weep. So, and I even, there's also a reference I like in Genesis 6, where it says that God looked at the children of men and their wickedness had multiplied so much. That God, as the King James puts it, that God regretted, making man. So any conscience, any heart that is beating, that is alive, seeing what is going on in the world, in our homes, in our school, the breakdown of society, you should be alarmed. You should be seriously alarmed at what is happening. And here Habakkuk is even angry at God. What have I done? Why are you making me see iniquity everywhere I look? Why? And you too, why are you idly looking at this? Are you not the judge of the whole earth? Why are you allowing this thing go on unanswered or unabated? So a background tip is that even though Josiah had been a good king, some scholars say that he either did not succeed or did not try much to to change maybe the civil service, for example. The same court officials that served his father, Amon, and probably Manasseh, were still the same guys. The same magistrates were still the same guys. The same governors and local government chairman. The same people running the education, the same people in the marketplaces, the same people in the temple, the same people everywhere. So the corruption was still there. Maybe restrained. So after the guy died and Jehoiakim took over, I mean, they just continued what they were doing before. And this is unbearable for the prophet. So this is the same situation, not only for Habakkuk, but for people like Jeremiah, Zephaniah. They saw all this and they were bugged out of their mind. Brian Nelson.
And I wanted to ask because when the Bible makes reference to these scriptures, after that's why I did the altars in Gibeon. I think there were five. Bible always makes reference that king after king, they didn't do that with altars. I think there was one king down two and left
others.
So I always wondered why that was so, because people were still worshiping. Wow.
So what's the question?
So my question is, do we have anything?
Oh, welcome.
So my question is, do we have anything with what Peter was talking
About Josiah.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay, so Brian Nelson has asked that. He's always wondered. So let me just subside. Brian Nelson just asked that he's always wondered when, I can't remember which Israelite king would tear down maybe 2 out of 5 pagan altars in Israel, would tear down 2, leave 3. Huh?
What
were they?
The high places.
Yeah, they were.
No, they were not. The
They
high
were
places
not
were
for
placed.
worshiping.
So the problem, so you see, for example, you say of Jehoshaphat, that he, even though his heart was with God, but yet he did not remove the high places.
Okay.
The problem with the high places was that there was only one authorized place to worship God.
Okay.
So, for example, you still had places in Bethel, so those were places that were set up.
Okay, so they were worshiping God in the wrong place.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So the high places.
All right.
That was the problem. Yeah. So that was the problem.
Okay, so thanks everybody for that correction. So Nelson is talking about the high places, not pagan altars. That on high places were unauthorized places where the people of Israelites were conveniently worshiping God rather than go to Jerusalem. That some kings will come, tear down 2, leave 3. Basically that their reforms were not always complete, and he's saying that it's similar with what is going on with Josiah. I'd say yes. Maybe there's only so much that someone can do. It depends on how much the person is, how zealous the person is for God. So, but judging by the way all those kings were so deeply and completely radically corrupt, I would say Josiah was. In fact, Josiah is like Josiah and Hezekiah are the 2 chief good kings from antiquity that I remember. So let's give them some credit. So, bro, Aki, I can see you're raising your hand, but let me quickly read these comments. Sister Shion says, Sister Yvonne says, I've always wondered about knowing when God is saying no, just giving me the silent treatment, or if it isn't yet time. Just a thought. Okay. Well, I think I don't know, maybe a simplistic answer. I think if God eventually does what you were praying about, it wasn't. But if he never does it, I think it's a no. I would say that. But we never know the difference. But either way, we have to wait on the Lord and trust him. And really, that's what this place is about. Okay, so Bracken is apologizing that his internet needed something. Needed a reset. Okay. So yeah, verse 3 is important to understand the context. Habakkuk, okay, think about this. You know, I mentioned one time, I don't know that it's last week or 2 weeks ago, where I said that, you know, it was like, I remember when I would walk on the streets of Abuja early in the morning, and I would see, you could just come out and see a car on top of a NEPA pole, and you walk down maybe, I don't know, half a kilometer, you see another car in the gutter, or crashed into somebody's shop, or flew so far off the road, you'd be wondering what happened, or you see a car lying in the center of the roundabout, that kind of fantastic accidents. And I said it was common to see in Abuja. You know, so what would have been happening here would have been you wake up in the morning and you see dead bodies all over the place, freshly killed people. You know, I don't know anybody in there, right? It should get to you. It should get to you. Maybe you wake up, you see people crying over their loved ones who had been killed in the night, or some people even killed in the day, in broad daylight. You know, so he says, destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise. So there was always, there were court cases, the people quarreling with each other. There was no peace in the land. People weren't getting along. You know, so much was happening, and the prophet was alarmed. He says in verse 4 that the law is paralyzed and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes perverted. Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 4. So he's just stretching the picture he's painting and saying that the law was not being obviously. The law can't be obeyed in a country where you have this level of violence and strife and wickedness and idolatry. So apparently the law at this time was redundant. It wasn't, nobody was paying attention to it. And it says justice never goes forth. And I say, of course, because the Jewish law was one of probably for lack of better English, the most just, one of the most justice, okay. You know, the most just legal systems in the ancient world. And so, and that was God's plan, for them to have a just society where even the poor, the aliens, they had rights, they were well taken care of. This wasn't what was happening in pagan countries. So when the law is set aside, all hell breaks loose. And that's what Habakkuk is complaining about. And he's complaining that God, all these things are happening in Jerusalem, in Judah, but you're quiet. There's radio silence from you. I've tried to prod you, to ask you to help, to intervene, but you're quiet. It says the wicked surround the righteous, meaning that wicked people were preying on righteous people, and there's impunity and there's injustice. In fact, let me just comment that in places where the law is not obeyed, where people are godless, righteous people they're sitting ducks for anything. You know, the wicked, they target godly people because they know that you won't do anything. Have you? You can't do anything. You're not going to do your own right. Not this kind of thing. You know, so for some weird reason, this was going on also in the time of Habakkuk. So in verse 5, from verse 5, we now get God's answer to this first complaint. Keep in mind all those long stories we talked about earlier. So God says to him in verse 5, sorry, my screen, verse 5. He says in verse 5, look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded, for I'm doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. Braki, please, sorry, I just remembered you were raising your hand. Please go ahead. You put your hand down?
No, you can go on, please.
So he says, look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded. So God replies Habakkuk, thank God. And then he says, see, look around you. Please, everybody, that you're muted. I know exactly where that is coming from. My house. Okay. Okay, so look among the nations and see. So what is saying, Habakkuk? Is it that you've not been watching the news? You've not been reading the newspapers? And look around, just look around. I've been busy. And basically what he's telling him is that God at that time, just like I narrated the history, was already reshaping the world order. And the people who were the world power, whom God had sent packing from Jerusalem years before, when they tried to attack it by sending an angel, God had defeated them using a tribe called the Chaldeans. And I'll talk more about them in the next section. But God is telling Habakkuk.
No, get one now. No, like this.
Hello. Touch screen. phone in the pocket, all those kind of things. Yes. So it says wonder and be astounded. For I'm doing a work in you that you won't believe what I've been up to. And then what is incredible about what God has been doing. So from verse 6 we see, it says, for behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening roams. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. What's going on here? So God says, see, I've been busy. It's like you've not been watching CNN. All right. Like I said, God had shifted God had effected a power shift from the Assyrians to the Babylonians. Okay, so the Chaldeans were, did I put something here for them? So basically the Chaldeans were, they're actually a smaller group or sub-nation south of Babylon, and they're an ancient people. In fact, I have a reference here from all the way back in Genesis, the first time they're mentioned. You remember Terah, Abraham's, he was Abraham's father, right? Yeah, he lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, right? The Chaldean town. So they were a specific tribe. All right. They were a specific tribe in southern Babylonia, now southern Iraq in our day. In fact, they have some people, they are completely decimated and impoverished people now in southern Iraq. And they were known for their aggressiveness. They were very wicked people, like we see in Nigeria. In Job chapter 1, verse 17, they were one of the groups that attacked his camels and his property, and killed some of his servants and took his stuff away. So they've been known for centuries to be a very violent, raiding, marauding group. But they had never really attained political power and influence in the Near East, until that time. God raised them up. God had been, of course, working in the background to raise them in their population. And in fact, what happened in Babylon was that the Chaldeans, they were one of other groups in Babylon. But God had it such that these Chaldeans, the more brutal of them, started producing a successive string of Babylonian kings until people like Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, all those guys, and eventually they came to, they rose to world power status, and they were more brutal than Assyria or probably anybody before them. So, and of course, the name Chaldean became synonymous with Babylon back then. And also, they were known for their astronomy and astrology. It is most likely from there, or at least as a result of their work, tracking the stars, and they kept detailed records of the astrological observations for hundreds of years. So it's actually one of the ways scholars believe that they were able to track the star of the Messiah's birth in the time of Jesus. They were able to find him. Okay, so basically, God ordained for them to grow strong and defeat Assyria. And this was going to be a fulfillment of prophecy, because I think I mentioned it last week. I didn't mention it last week, that through Isaiah, God had said, God had told Hezekiah, I see these Babylonians that year, because then they were a smaller nation. They came on a diplomatic visit to visit King Hezekiah of Judah. And he too now went to go and show them, I don't know, I was drunk, and then showed them all the way into the temple, the sacred treasures in the temple. Then Isaiah tells them, I see these Babylonian people. At the time is coming when these treasures that you've showed them is going to be carried off to their country. Okay, so at that time, they were not a country that could pose such a threat. But in just a few decades, God had ramped up the country, that they had defeated the mighty Assyria and rose to power. So that was an astonishing thing, and that was what God was trying to point Habakkuk's attention to. So, and God described them, He says they are a bitter and hasty nation, very violent people and hasty. People that they are very quick to violence. They're very quick to violence. I don't speak the Yoruba well. So I have to say, they were very quick to be violent rather, and they march the entire world, seizing dwellings, not their own. That's a reference to them. Just the way the herdsmen, what they were doing, killing people and chasing, displacing people. They were actually taking over their towns and villages. Did you know that? So that's a recent example of that. So in those days, that was the way countries expanded their territory. Just go and look for some weaker, smaller country or tribe, overrun them, chase them away, kill them all if you can, sell the rest into slavery, take their lands, take their water source, take their farms and everything, their buildings. Okay, so verse 7 says they are dreaded and fearsome. For them to be dreaded and fearsome means that everybody knows them. Like I said, from ancient times, in the time of Job, they've been known to be very violent people. So it says their justice and dignity go forth from themselves, meaning that these guys, they are wicked, they know the hear word. They are a law unto themselves, right? They are not the kind of people you can appease with diplomacy, that you can send someone to talk. They are not the kind of people you can talk to. And what doesn't mean that they were uneducated, but because of they worshipped, their patron god was Marduk or Baal, and he was a storm god. It was the god who gave them victory. As long as they're concerned, anybody that's not Babylonian was stubble to be burned by their fire. It was fair game for them. So they didn't want to discuss anything with anybody. And in verse 8, God says, their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. In those days, horses were a major, I think the only thing worse than having war horses and being able to use them when the horse was having chariots to go with them. Because how they use them, if you watch all these epic movies, in those days they fought in formation, right? And it was very important to keep that formation. Because if you fight scattered, it's very easy to decimate even a large army. So what these guys will do is they will use their horses and just charge at your guys. Where you standing, when you see horses coming, and they will jump all over your guys and just scatter your lines. Before they regroup again, they'll come again, run through. By the time they scatter, they just pick what is left, chase them one by one and kill them off. So they had mastered the art of using their horses in their warfare, and they were using it to defeat everybody. And now they were coming for Judah. So God talks about their military strength, using their horses and all. In verse 9, God says that they all come for violence, all their faces forward, and they gather captives like sand. So they come for violence. And these guys, like I said, diplomacy is not in their dictionary. When they come, they don't take any prisoners. Well, this says they gather captives, but I mean that they will kill and kill. They love violence, basically. And then they gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. So basically, that these guys, in those days, kings used to be respected. And but these guys, they had no respect for any king or any ruler because they trusted in their own military prowess. And no matter how large your kingdom is, no matter how strong your walls are, no matter how good your army is, we are better. So and it's just like they say that don't get involved with somebody that doesn't have shame. Like you'll be the one to lose out. In the same way, you don't want to fight with somebody that loves violence for violence sake, right? So so this was the kind of people that these guys were. They were not the conventional army back then. They were very wicked. They were very, very violent. They were very fierce. So, and then in verse 11, it says, then they sweep by like the wind and go on. Guilty men whose own might is their God. So these guys were very proud of. I mean, we just had the self-denial conference. These guys were outrightly arrogant, and they trusted in their strength, which they believe came from their God, Baal or Marduk, depending on which language you're using. And just guilty men, meaning that these guys had blood on their hands. These guys are done and undone. They are done so many hideous things. Yes, brother.
So how are we supposed to think about this? That God is saying He's the one raising up men that He calls wicked, guilty, bloodthirsty devils that are killing innocent people. Because if I was just thinking about it, if I was to get, let's say, for example, bad example, the one raising up bandits, who are shooting, destroying people and killing people. So
how are we to think about
it?
Okay, so the first thing I would say, so Bobole has asked a question that he's just thinking that, if God were threatening him or us today with raising maybe herdsmen or bandits or Boko Haram to come and attack us, how are we to process that? How are we to think of God using wicked people like that, right? That's exactly Habakkuk's. That's exactly Habakkuk's dilemma here. That's how is it that a holy God like you has anything at all to do with people like this? How of what use could they be for you? But remember the passage we read from Deuteronomy, where God told them, the terms of the covenant, and how that if you're idolatrous, I'm going to have you scattered all over the world. You'll be defeated by your enemies. You'll be cursed in the land and the fields, all those kind of things. So this was in fulfillment of the covenant curse. Because like I said before, that they had 20 kings. That was the northern king of Israel, and then the northern tribe of Israel. The southern kingdom had also had a long line of mostly evil kings, of which some of the good ones were Hezekiah and Josiah, and I can't remember anybody else. Jehoshaphat. Okay,
Those two were the best.
those were the standouts. So basically, even the feeble efforts of those good kings was not enough to dissuade God. The people have continued in large-scale sin and idolatry, and this is the judgment. So basically, God is saying, the way I think it was Nebuchadnezzar when they were going to throw Daniel, was it Daniel? No, his 3 friends into the fire, and then you know what? These guys heat up the furnace 7 times hotter than usual. So this is judgment, premium judgment coming for the people of Judah. And even God is not excusing that these are evil men. In fact, he had already said through, I think I have it here somewhere, through one of the prophets, maybe when I get to it, I'll touch on it, that these Babylonians, that he had already judged them, that these guys is going to destroy them eventually. But before he does, right, he uses them to judge Judah. So, like I said, that was exactly what was making Habakkuk confused.
Sometimes God likes to show us that can do what he wants to do. Like he said, even if you're told do not do it, like he can use the worst.
Yes, out of
He can
what we
do
expect.
anything worse.
All right, so Uche has said that he believes that sometimes it's like God wants to show us that he can do actually whatever he wants to do, more than we expect. Yes,
Yeah.
bro, Shala.
So I think we also need to understand that if the of Judah or repented at that time, it's not happening.
Yes. In fact, let me add to that. Yeah, so Broshala said that we should remember that if the people of Judah have been obeying God, that this kind of thing would not come upon them. And I want to add something to that. I see all the kingdoms of the world, like Babylon combined with Assyria and Egypt, and who else was this big world back then? Egypt was a big world. That is it, Abi. Okay. Even the Romans or the Greeks, add them together. Nobody would have been able to defeat Judah if they were obeying to God. Is that simple? Nobody, you would not allow, Judah would have been the apple of God's eye. You would not allow anybody to touch them. So this was a direct consequence of their sin. So what is happening to them is what will happen to them if all God is doing is taking back is removing his hedge around them. So when God removes his hedge around you, like we say in local balance, anything that you see, we can take. Like Broshola said, this has to do with them disobeying God and breaking their covenants. All right, so I didn't know where I stopped. I think verse 11.
Yeah.
So in verse 12, Habakkuk comes with the second complaint. So remember in the first 4 or 5 verses, Habakkuk had complained, Lord, why are you allowing Judah sink into sin and like this and injustice? Why am I praying to you and you're not answering? Why are you silent? And then God answers him, see, I've been busy, and this is what I've been doing in the background. I'm preparing your judgment. It's still boiling. It's not hot enough. By the time it's boiling, I will come and douse it, point on you people, basically. So, and he tells Habakkuk, I'm bringing the Babylonians. That's what I've been busy doing. I'm bringing Babylonians. And then Habakkuk comes back to God with the second complaint, and he says, in verse 12, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. So he's coming to God, and just wait. You see the trickery, the way we pray. When you want to say something bad, you first start with something positive. So first is acknowledging God's greatness, and he says, and this is sincere on his part. He's saying we shall not die, that we will survive this thing, that whatever is coming, we will survive it because of who you are. Okay. And I think you can look at Psalm 90, verses 1 to 2. And it says, O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. So I understand that you have ordained them as a judgment, that you're going to use them to judge us and use them as reproof towards Judah. Okay, he acknowledges that he worships God, he acknowledges God. And then he starts in verse 13. He says, you who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent? And when the wicked swallows up the man, and when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he. So basically what he's saying is that I thought you were the God who cannot see evil. You know, your eyes are so pure, you can't look upon evil, and you cannot look at wrongdoing. Why are you now looking idly when traitors, are traitors and remain silent when wicked people swallow up? Basically, it's a reference for wicked people oppressing and killing, righteous people more righteous than them. And what he's saying is that basically, that how can you bear to look when Babylon comes to fight against and defeat Judah? How can you look? That as bad as we are, Judah, that's what he said, as bad as we are, we are better than those guys, right? Those guys are animals. Those guys are wicked. They've never had your law one day, and how can you be looking? How is this possible? So, and he continues his complaints. So he's questioning God, and he's wondering why God can use such a wicked nation to carry out his plans. Can't you look for a better, at least more godly nation to come and execute your judgment? And it seemed to him that God was acting out of character. And then, like I said earlier, okay, this reference is Isaiah. I don't know if this is Isaiah 13, 1 to 4, or Isaiah 1. I didn't write it well. I'll correct it in the presentation. So, or Jeremiah 51. So, is that correct? That's not correct. Sorry, I got the reference wrong. I didn't write it well. So basically, the Babylonians themselves have been marked for judgment. So, and Habakkuk continues in verse 14. He says, you make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them. He's talking about Babylon. Like he brings all of them. In fact, he says God makes mankind like the fish of the sea and crawling things that have no ruler. That basically, God, you've handed us over to these guys. You've made us like fish for a fisherman, and that's how he describes Babylon. It says he brings all of them up with a hook, drags them out of nets. Excuse me, please. Isaiah 13, right? Verse what? From verse 1. Okay, yeah. So where Isaiah talks about God marking the Babylonians for judgment. Okay, thank you. Isaiah chapter 13. So, and then he describes them like a fisherman. He says, he brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them into his drag net. So he rejoices and is glad. And you think of the bad guy laughing in a sinister way to himself. And then, therefore, he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his drag net. For by them he lives in luxury and his food is rich. What's going on here? Habakkuk is describing to God that this guy is almost like you've made us like fish for this guy, because fishing was a major occupation back then in Judah. He had plenty of water and all of that. Many of Jesus' disciples were fishermen. So, and he uses that example, that imagery. He says, we're like, you've made all of us, not just Judah, all the nations, because Babylon had not just conquered Assyria, they dealt with Egypt. They had gone around beating everybody black and blue, and it was almost like the whole world was not enough for them. Then he says, after this fisherman catches everybody in his net, he rejoices and is glad. He trusts in his own self. And then he sacrifices to his nets and makes offerings to his drag net, for by them he lives in luxury. So that this guy is full of himself, he's idolatrous, he literally worships his own military might, because that's what the drag net would refer to. And this guy worships his own military might. He worships other gods. He lives in luxury, his food is rich from raiding other people's lands. And then he asks the question in verse 17. He said, is he then to keep on emptying his nets? Oh, sorry. For those of us online, tell me that I didn't move my screen. It is on in verse 17 now. But is he then to keep on emptying his nets and mercilessly killing nations forever? So he's saying, oh Lord, that this guy, this very, very bad, twisted, disgusting people, that is it for how long? He's asking basically the same thing we asked earlier. How long is this going to continue? Is he going to keep doing this and killing other nations and enslaving them forever? And maybe we should go on and read verse 1 of chapter 2 and end it there. In chapter 2, verse 1, it says, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. So basically he's saying that, you know what, he uses the imagery of the watchtower, the watchpost, and those are towns and cities usually had at their corners or strategic points along their wall, towers where soldiers would stay, they would mount guard day and night and keep on the lookout, so that no foreign army can take them by surprise. Any attackers. So basically, he's saying that, like a watchman, I'm going to sit up there and wait for God to answer. The way you've asked, you think you've made a slam dunk, a home run. I think that there's no way God can get out of this question. You see, this question is a jam question. There's no way he can answer this question. Let me see what he's going to say. Let me see what he's going to answer me. And then he says, this is where I'm waiting for you. And then he goes up there. Maybe he did that literally, or just speaking figuratively. To wait for God to answer him. And it says, let me look out to see what he will say to me. And he's waiting for God's next answer. And that's much of chapter 2. And God will continue next week in our reading. So I have a few points that I think the new pattern is to spell out lessons learned or points. So I'll just share a few that I wrote out. There may be more, and maybe when I finish, we can share. So number one, God allows for brutal honesty in prayer. What do I mean by that? A lot of times I notice that people are not really honest when they pray. Maybe because I only hear them pray in public. Maybe in their private prayers, they're more honest, they're more open. Okay, so that could be a factor. But just so that we know that, that God is securing himself. He's able to take our most difficult questions, our most perplexing situation, whatever it is we're going through, you can throw it down at his feet. God is able to take questions. I think Job also had heavy questions for God, as it were, even though he crossed the line into questioning God's wisdom and God's righteousness for allowing such sufferings to come upon him. But God did respond to him. God did not rebuke him for coming to him. So basically, God allows for brutal, be as honest as you can with God in prayer. If something is bad, if you're in pain, you can say, Lord, this thing is really bad. I don't understand what is going on. Why do I find myself in this situation? Why is this going? Why is this happening? So, of course, with bounds of respect for his divine being, maybe let's be watchful, let's be careful no matter what has happened. Might not get away so easily like Job did and like Habakkuk too. Anyway, so number two, I'll say that God's ways and reason. Maybe if Rakim is there, please read for us from Isaiah chapter 55, verses 8 to 9. And then who else is online to read for us from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 25. Thank you, Toby. I remembered late. You're saying to don't forget to turn the slide. All right, so yes, Isaiah chapter 5, verses 8 to 9.
Okay. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts.
Okay. So here, Isaiah the prophet, God is speaking actually through Isaiah. He's saying that we are not operating at the same wavelength, basically. Think of maybe a little child who can't understand for his life, why the mom and dad cannot give him biscuits and ice cream morning to night, right? Try explaining nutrition, or the importance of eating good food, solid food, proper food, as against eating junk food all the time. Try explaining it to maybe a 2-year-old or 3-year-old. You won't get very far. But the gap between us and God is wider than the gap between a parent and a child, no matter the age. It's infinite. Okay, so and then God is saying here through Isaiah that my ways are not your ways. The way I think, the way I do things, they are not things that you would understand. And so what is a proper response towards a God whom we don't have all figured out? We don't know all of his ways. We don't know everything about the way he acts, the way he moves, the way he does his things. I think the answer is very clear. It is to trust him, basically to trust his wisdom, to trust his heart, as Spurgeon says. I'll come up with a quote later, I'll show the quote later. To trust him. Just to trust him. Is that simple? Is that simple? It's extremely difficult. It's the most difficult thing in the world to do, to trust God. I'm sure everybody here, but ask you, do you trust God? Everybody say yes. But when you find yourself in certain situations, where you're beginning to question God's competence, you're beginning to question his methods, you're beginning to question his timing, you're beginning to question his wisdom, you're beginning to question if he knows what he's doing. In fact, if you've never been there, maybe you've not been a Christian for very long, but it's a very, very dark place. And the only way to survive it and come out of it is to trust the Lord. Okay, so that's the second lesson. The third one I would say is that we must also realize that we know more than today, more than Habakkuk did back then. Okay, yeah, someone was going to read for us from 1 Corinthians 1:25. Please, somebody online. Bracken, if you can go move there, that's fine.
1 Corinthians 1. Okay.
Okay, let's share one read.
Okay, 1 Corinthians 1:1-5, right?
No, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 25.
Okay, 25. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men.
Yes.
Because the foolishness.
Yes, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Even if God was having a bad day, even if God was not at his best, he would still be, east from west in terms of, he would still be in a class by himself compared to men. And so I think that as Christians, we always have those existential crises when you're asking all those kind of questions. Is God really aware of what's happening to me? Is God really aware what is going on here? Is God really aware what's going on in the church? Is God really aware what is going on in the world? Trust me, he's in the background orchestrating every last detail of what is going on, both directly and indirectly. What he has ordained is actively, turning the wheels and making it happen. He's the sovereign God. So I was going to say that we know more than Habakkuk did back then. We know that God works all things together for the good of those who love him. It may not seem like that now, but eventually you have to say that's the key word. You have to trust that eventually, last, like Job said, he said, I know that my Redeemer lives. I know that, I will stand and I will see him. Last, it will end well, basically. And yes, bro.
Just to say something about my pastor. I had a long time ago to say.
You have to speak up.
I said just to say something that a pastor had a long time ago used to say. There's a way of saying the story where the last is in this world. It's always turn out well. And we pray to do that.
Yes,
but for sure, it's on that day. But sometimes the last doesn't.
It's not here.
Not like this.
Yes. Thank you for pointing that out. So Deacon Willie has said that one of his former pastors used to say that last, that's end hope, that end game that we always hope for, that everything will turn out all right, that everything will be fine. That's not always in this life, and that's a good point to make. That just like Job said, I say last, I will see him, and I know that everything will be fine. But it is not always in this life that we will have closure. It is not always in this life that we will have vindication. It's not always in this life that we have deliverance. God doesn't always save us out of our troubles. He doesn't always do that. But whatever the case, we should trust that eventually, what Scripture calls the day of the Lord, he will right every wrong. He will make everything right. He will make all things beautiful in his time. So we must, so Jeremiah 29:11 is a reference I have here, along with Romans 8:28. Jeremiah 29:11 is where it says that, for I know the plans that I have towards you, thoughts of good and not of evil, to give you an expected hope. And he was talking to Judah, so this applied directly to Habakkuk back in these days. I said, don't worry, even though I'm bringing this very ravenous group, the Babylonians, that I have plans of good, they are not going to exterminate you guys. Okay, so so basically that's it. So I have a quote from Charles Spurgeon. I'll just read it out for those of us online here. Okay, so I've shared all those points already just now. Charles Spurgeon said that God is too good to be unkind, and he is too wise to be mistaken. And when we cannot trace his hand, we must trust his heart. We must trust his heart. This is something I've had to repent of, because I've thought sometimes, Lord, I honestly don't understand what you're doing. And I said this in a way that, are you sure that you're not dropping the ball, in this direction? God never drops the ball. But even when it seems like he's dropping the ball, you should trust his heart. You should trust that he has your best interests at heart. You should trust that he has never not forgotten you. Like he says, I will never leave you or forsake you. You should trust that he has also not abandoned the church. When I encounter some people, they lament that Peter, that is almost like, what is God looking at? And look at the state of the church, that we don't have unity. Everybody is facing 360 different directions. There is no bond. There's no Christian, common Christian testimony. People are divided on all kinds of doctrines and problems and issues. And they express despair that, are you sure? Almost like, are you sure this thing is for real? Always trust that God knows what he's doing. I'm always vehement to, when people point to church history at times when it looks like God took a break from running the church or running the world. I'm always vehement to defend and say that what looks like chaos to you is actually perfectly in the will of God. Perfectly in the will of God. God never takes his hands off the wheels. He's always in control, and he will bring about his perfect will in the end. So any comments, any questions? I used
to think some persons used to accuse God say that free condition. Now we're not actually saying God controls. And something occurred to me that if God controls everything and things are still the way they are, all it is not controlling.
Yes.
Things are like this, and God is working in the plans and control of everything. What if it's working?
So, but Nelson is making a point. He says that sometimes people say that how is it that we have free will when we also say from scripture that God controls everything, and he's saying that he often responds by saying that if things are like this, that God is in control, that if he were not in control, that you'd see real chaos. That you'd see real chaos. In fact, you wouldn't be here standing and talking about things going haywire. Exactly. So what looks like chaos to us is perfectly in the wisdom of God. Just like Jesus' death. Jesus' death to his disciples then would have looked like the most senseless thing ever. I mean, this was the Messiah. Why on earth would the Messiah have to die at the hands of these very disgusting, sinful people? And die, even if he wants to die, can't he die honorable death? He has to die the worst and most traumatic and stigmatized form of death in those days. To die on the cross, naked, in front of everybody. What possible good could come from that? And I think Jesus's example is, for us Christians, the best case to remember, to always understand and remember that even when it looks completely dark, completely bleak, completely senseless, God is going to bring something out of it that, like he said to Habakkuk, that even if someone told you, you would not believe it. Who could have believed the amount of salvation and goodness and blessing that has come out of the death of Jesus Christ, spreading to the ends of the earth? Who would have believed that if God had said that then? So basically the key lesson for us that Habakkuk is learning in slow motion is to trust God. Yes.
And
after this other folks. Just remember Simeon again. And it was killing me to see Jesus die. But his words were true for all from those people. How Christ comes. And just seeing that again. I'm just imagining Mary because it's like the common factor is there. Mary seeing that, I didn't in her heart and saying, wow, this baby is the constitution of hope of Israel.
Yes.
We need to go to the scripture. She hasn't read different like every single one for that and say, wow, my Messiah has come. And then finally, on the death on the cross, that's what the 3 years and things with our lives and naked and ashamed. And just thinking like one thing, it's like talking about something about how was mentioned, them swallowing up
The righteous.
the righteous, yeah. And just how disturbing that would be, and how one could see that as to where the hope of Israel.
Yes. Yes.
So, how much God walked out of that.
Yes. So Bro Courage is giving us another angle to it, using Jesus' example, how that was it Simeon in Luke 2, prophesied and spoke to Mary and Joseph that holding the child Jesus and said, this is the consolation of Israel, and saying that how this did in fact play out in his life, even though he himself didn't live long enough to see it. So Jesus' example is, I think, by far the best, really, by far the best of what Habakkuk is struggling with. So if Habakkuk had lived past the time of Jesus, I'm sure God would have just pointed him to scripture, pointed him to the New Testament, to look at and say, I've proven myself, I can break light out of darkness and sense out of what looks like senselessness. All that out of chaos. Let's take it away.
I said I was encouraged reading this because sometimes when I read the newspaper, and that time, it's good to not only read the newspaper but to read the Bible. Because if we don't read the Bible and read the newspaper and see all that is going on in our own country, sort of almost wonder that where is God? So when you read this story and see God actually even saying more difficult times than our own time, terrible things, and God still saying, actually, I'm working. There's something that you can't understand that I'm working out with this. It helps me to see that there are many things I will never be able to figure out. Why do we have the foreign bandits, headsmen, all this chaos of the present center, unknown gunmen, all these terrible things that we see everywhere. But then to say through it all, God is still God. We can still pray, and His kingdom can never be destroyed.
Thank you, Brother. So that reminds me, I was going to add that the reading Habakkuk, the teaching about divine sovereignty, is like the cornerstone for my heart, because I listen to the news a lot. In traffic is almost the number one thing I listen to, apart from sermons or music. And it's always bad news. In fact, there's a guy I listen to, if you guys know him, Jimmy Disu. He's one of the analysts. He's now on Nigeria Info. He used to be at Classic FM, Lagos Talks. He's an old man. He's probably going to 70. I've met him before. So he came one day and they gave him the newspaper to read, the headlines to analyze. And he almost breaks down into tears. He's like, for goodness sake. And at this age, he's been reading bad news all his life. And the man breaks down. You're an old man. He breaks down and he's almost crying. He was just lamenting that day on the studio. 30-minute program. It took like maybe 12 to 15 minutes lamenting. This is bad news. How can you wake up in the morning? How are we seeing in this country? Wake up in the morning, you're reading this kind of thing. I can't even repeat. It's all those human angle stories, all those very bad stories of things that people do. It's like, I can't read this, So, like Omole said, if you're following world news too, there's fear of war, there's Russia trying to invade Ukraine, there's the EU standing behind Ukraine, and then God knows if China is going to join Russia. We don't know if it's World War III. We don't know. Maybe it's going to be just a rumor, but the war back down. I hope they do. But whatever it is that's going on in the world, we can never see. There are some kind of, I don't know if you've watched all these videos, maybe sometimes I see them on social media, where somebody shows that puts a pattern of maybe arranges something in a particular way and then just touches one. And then they start falling in a particular pattern. It's so beautiful to watch. I don't know how many years it takes to set up those things. It was so beautiful to watch. And then the thing falls in a particular, so you see the beauty of it when you stand back and look at the whole thing unfold. We are only seeing details, we don't see the whole picture, but God does. And the point again is trust. Is to trust that God knows what He's doing. I've seen that scene before where I started to question, are you sure what is going on there? I've done everything by the book, I don't understand. And to trust God, to learn to trust God no matter what's happening. In fact, one of my best examples would be Job. The unthinkable happened to him. He didn't have the advantage of having the Bible like we do. Please just open to hymn number 104. He didn't have the advantage of having the Bible and solid Bible teaching about divine sovereignty. He didn't know to expect such a thing from God. And then all of a sudden, his entire world comes crashing down. And then he says, naked I came from my mother's womb. And naked I will return. 104, version 1. So that's, for me, another excellent example. May the Lord help us. It's easy to say it now when there's nothing happening. It's easy to say it now when there's nothing happening. However, it's the first thing that you forget when you're in a troubled situation. So please let's stick around after we sing our hymn. If you can only pray for us, sister sitting here, and then we can close. So please, when we finish, please don't disappear. Say hi before you go. Say hello. So let's sing. Please remind me the tune. Worship the King, all glorious above. Okay, fine. Let's go. Oh, worship the King, all glorious above. Oh, gratefully sing His power and His love. Our shield and defender, the ancient of days, pavilion in splendor and girded with praise.